Hello, welcome back. This is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is the Great Big History Podcast. In this episode, do South Korea from 1954 to 1988. South Korea has dictatorships, military rule, and not much democracy, just as we talked about, which led to, surprisingly, government instability. Now, it's surprising because the whole point of having a dictatorship is not to have government instability. That's why the United States supported the military rule. The idea was it's self-perpetuating. It's a dictatorship. And yet there are 5 republics in 50 years. South Korea is a mess. The 6th republic in 1987 was the first democratic government. From 1950 to 1987, you had 5 republics. So that's really more like 30 years. 35 years. But it's the first democratic government. Why? Because they were getting the Olympics. This is one of those instances where the Olympics actually did some good. The idea was this was South Korea coming out as a debutante of being we are arriving as a real country. And well, in 1987, 1988, communism is obviously failing in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. It's not doing particularly well in China. And we've talked about that. It's doing better, I guess. It's a little more stable than the 1970s. Well, anything would have been more stable than what happened in the 1970s, than the Cultural Revolution. But Chinese communism doesn't look like it's going to take over the world either. And so looking at that, you say, well, we're going to be democratic. How are we going to be a real country that will host the Olympics? We're going to be democratic. And so they created the 6th Republic, a democratic government. And that's the second thing about the Seoul Olympics is it's a success. The 1988 Olympics is the first Olympics that isn't tied into, it's the first Olympics in 10 years that's not tied into the Cold War fighting. Every country participates. Remember the Moscow Olympics in 1980? The United States says, we're not going to be part of this. And with it, most of the Western alliance. Because the United States and its Western allies did that in 1980, the Los Angeles Olympics was the same way. The Eastern Bloc countries said, we're not going to participate. And so it looked like the 1980s, and I grew up in this period, looks like there's going to be a nuclear war. We went back, I know the boomers, the old timers are like, when I was a kid, we used to have to hide under our desks. I'm like, dude, I did too. That's how crazy the 80s were. They had to go back to hiding underneath your desks. We had nuclear fallout drills. It was one step away from fallout. And so the Seoul Olympics was this, no. The world can have peace again. And notice it's happening in Asia, not in Europe. Europe is way too contentious. It's happening in Asia and in a place where the Cold War was fought. Seoul had been bombed. Seoul had been occupied. Seoul had been liberated. Seoul had been burned. Seoul was the target of 100,000 artillery shells in 1988. It was still the front line of the Cold War. And it was a successful Olympics for the purpose of bringing countries together. So if you want a kind of start of where the Asian century kind of begins, 1988 Seoul Olympics is Asia kind of saying, hi, we've arrived. I mean, Japan has gotten rich by this point. If you've already done one of the Japanese lectures, Disneyland has opened up in Tokyo in 1983. Has already opened up. So, but that's Japan. And Japan, as we've talked about, has been different in the Western eyes. Korea is clearly Asian. And it's the arrival of the non-Japanese Asian world. Which you may go, yo, professor, that's kind of racist. But that's not me. That's foreign politics. It's white people. It's the way it was looked at. Japan is separate. You know, it's Asia, but it's, I don't know how to explain it. It's just separate. It's just Japan. Look at the G8, right? The 8 industrialized largest economies. There's Japan. It's white guys and Japan. So the Seoul Olympics. You get a democratic government in South Korea. You get South Korea announcing itself as a real country in the world, as something to be taken seriously. You get the arrival of Asia as a political force, as a cultural force. The Sixth Republic will also have what's called Nordpolitik, which Nord is north. It's Swedish for north. It's, you know, it's such a weird thing. But we're going to use a European language. We're going to use French for, you know, but it's relations with the communist world. And that was Nordpolitik. It meant China and it meant North Korea. And in 1990, the first diplomatic exchanges happened with North Korea. There's a little bit during the Seoul Olympics because they didn't want the North Korean army to do anything during this, to ruin. You know, it's like your crazy cousins. You know, you're always worried about, well, you know, they're crazy and you all know they're crazy. But you didn't want, you know, they live next door, but, you know, they could mess up stuff when you're having your nice party. So there were diplomatic negotiations during the lead up to the Seoul Olympics and during the Seoul Olympics to make sure things stay calm. And that led to these first diplomatic exchanges in 40 years. South Korea becomes the quintessential Asian tiger. They're going to take on the Japanese model. Now, Japan had been doing this since the early 60s, really. It's going to be export-driven industrial growth. They're going to make cheap goods that they're going to sell to the United States. They're going to sell to U.S. consumers. They're cheap. They're not good. But there's going to be a lot of them. Industrialization is going to allow that to happen. And you're going to get huge government-private companies, the chaebols, kind of like the Japanese versions of this. And the chaebols, we've seen them. We know them. They're Samsung, right? You know, they're LG, right? These are companies that existed before in the same way that they were a private company that had huge government alliances. We saw this in the early attempts at industrialization in the 19th century. We saw this earlier. So they just continue the model. And since it worked in Japan, they continued it. So these are private companies, but they have a huge alliance and working relationship and financing from the government. They also get monopolies so that they're not competing, so that they don't have to worry about undercutting other Korean companies. They can worry about undercutting American, Japanese, European companies. And 3, lots of education. Lots of education. Like even more than other Asian countries. And we can talk about, there's of course, it goes back to Confucius. There's a lot of emphasis on education in all, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Confucianism, in all kinds of Asian philosophy and in governmental theory, government politics. But even in that context, Korea is a plus. Korea is more than even the other countries. And that's because it's a reaction to the Japanese tyranny. Remember, the Japanese didn't let people go to school. They didn't let Koreans use their own language. So that whatever it was, by 1930, only 5% of Koreans had a bachelor's degree or had any college. Or was it any high school? This is a reaction. We're not going to be that again. We're not going to be subservient to anybody again. And what does this do? If you're watching the video, you could see this explosion, especially after democracy, after 1988. You're talking about a line that's going 45, 60 degrees up. From 1988, it just leaves. Whereas even as late as 1968, South Korea and North Korea are essentially the same in terms of wealth. By 1988, South Korea is double the wealth of North Korea, and it just keeps going. By 2016, the gross national income per capita is almost American. That is huge productivity. That's wealth. Korea goes from one of the poorest places in East Asia to on par with any European or North American country, any industrialized country. It's at that level. It has democracy. It's got wealth. It's got regulations. It's got education. It's got healthcare. And so the days of like a nice American white couple adopting a Korean baby, that happened when I was a kid. And it was considered, oh, you're helping them. They're poor. They can't even feed themselves. That's over. Like, I grew up in an age when, you could get a Korean or a Chinese baby because life was so terrible there, so poor, that people were basically selling their kids or giving them away, hoping for a better life. And Americans and Canadians took advantage of that. And we hope gave a lot of those kids a better life. I've known some of them in my lifetime. That doesn't happen anymore. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen 100%, but South Korea can now feed itself. It's now wealthy enough to take care of its kids. That's huge. That's one generation. That's in my lifetime. That's what trade, that's what money, that's what democracy did. That's what an alliance with the United States did. So by the 2000s, it is the third richest country in East Asia. It makes good products. Remember, in the 1960s, it made junk products, but it made them cheap. So people would buy them, and you wouldn't care, because if they broke, you just buy another one. Now they make good products. And you get Hyundai and Samsung and LG. Right, LQ. But it's LG. You buy your phone, right? Chips. Semiconductors. Some of the most complicated machines on Earth, industrialization on Earth, is done in Korea. That money creates culture. And that culture is what separates North Korea from South Korea. So that Koreans who looked the same in 1950, who spoke the same, who acted the same, who lived essentially the same lives, are now living in two different universes. And we have been a part of that. Gangum Style was the first huge Korean cultural export to the West. It was simultaneously the arrival of K-pop, though it's not quite K-pop, and I know it gets complicated, but Korean music and YouTube, because it was, oh my God, 1 billion people have seen Gangum Style, this video. And it was the idea for the first time Korea could export culture rather than import it. And now you go the next step, and that's K-pop. And it's the Korean take on the American British boy and girl bands. But it's distinctly unlike the 1990s, where K-pop was really American bands, Americans, or Koreans doing American stuff. K-pop is distinctly Korean. It doesn't use Westerners anymore. It's not covering Western styles. It's not American, but with a Korean face. K-pop is Korean, right down in. It uses the model of American British boy bands, but it is distinctly Korean, right down to its soul. For both good and bad. Because there's problems in K-pop, especially for female artists. But Gangnam Style and K-pop are Korea exporting culture, and only strong cultures, only strong countries can do that. That's 100 years. Remember, in 1905, it was illegal to write or speak in Korean. And now Americans, Japanese, Brits, Australians are listening to songs in Korean. Korean writers start exporting. So what do they write about? They're dealing with the trauma of division, of war, of dictatorship, of family separation, of the last 50 years, of the world they grew up in. We see this in German writers in the 50s and the 60s. We see this in French writers and French movies in the 50s and the 60s. So one is the trauma of war, division, dictatorship is going to power the first generation of writers. They're dealing with the Korean War and its after effects. The second generation of writers is going to deal with going from poor to rich. Excuse me. They go from poor to rich in one generation, which freaks people out. It's not easy. You were a peasant. Your grandparents were peasants. You're making $50,000 living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Seoul. Like living essentially an American lifestyle or a European lifestyle. That's massive. Your grandparents lived like their grandparents, who lived like their grandparents. You're living a completely different lifestyle, which is weird for everybody. If you know musicians, you know the second album any band always has a, wow, we got rich. That was weird. It always has a we got rich song. The Counting Crows has one, or it has many. You can make the argument that their second album is an entire Getting Rich album. But everyone's got them. Every band that suddenly got rich has a song, or if not a full album, which is, oh my God, this is weird. And so you get a generation of writers who deal with that. That generation is going to be the 80s and in the 90s. Whereas the generation in the 60s, the 50s, they're still living the trauma. But the 60s and the 70s is dealing with division and war and dictatorship. The people of the 90s and early 2000s is, what does it mean to be Korean now? How do we go from being poor to rich? And all of them are dealing with the issue of how Western should Korea be? Clearly, America is awesome. They bought our goods. They saved us from Japan. I mean, if there's an ally in East Asia, it is Korea and Taiwan. Just the goodwill of like history of the American century is they saved us from being conquered by North Korea, which now you look at what happened to North Korea. In 1950, you might have said, oh, it won't be too bad. Now you look and go, oh, we dodged a massive change in all of our lives that nobody could have seen coming, or very few people could have seen coming. And so, but American culture is so strong. Take a look at what will happen in Japan. Do we want to become American? We didn't want to become European in the 19th century. We didn't want to become Japanese for a lot of reasons in the 19th and the 20th century. Do we want to replace that with Americanness? And so the writers are dealing with that issue. America is awesome, but how American do we want to be? How Western? We avoided it in the 19th and 20th century when the Europeans were taking stuff, forcing people to become Western. Is that an issue of becoming willingly Western? And so writers are dealing with that issue. So you can see different writers of different generations are dealing with the after effects of the Cold War, of the Korean War. Because none of these things happen. None of these three pieces happen without the Korean War, without the Cold War. What about North Korea? From 1954 to 2005, it's going to end up very different. Kim Il-sung, he liked Stalin. He liked Stalin's power. And so what does he do? He does Stalinism. Not communism. Not Marxism. Stalinism, which is you murder your rivals so that you're the only one who can run the government, and then you build a cult of personality around you. That it's not a government of the people. Now you go, whoa, that's democracy. But communism was supposed to be literally a government of the people. Marxism doesn't even have a government. Since everyone is working together. So the Communist Party is supposed to, okay, but anybody can be a part of it. It's supposed to be a government literally of the people. And that's not this anymore. It's a government of Kim Il-sung, of the Kims. It's a deification monarchy, but with the powers of a modern dictatorship. Khrushchev's criticism of Stalin in 1953 led to a break with the Soviet Union. How dare you? Stalin was great. How dare you criticize him? And it means we're going to F this. We're done with the Soviet Union. We're totally in with China. I mean, it was going that way since 1951 when the Chinese army invaded. We talked about this already. But now it's 1953, between 1953 and 1956. It's now a break. We're not going to be allied with Khrushchev. We like Stalin. We like Stalin's way of doing things. We don't know who this new generation is. We're going to do our own thing. And we're going to be allied with China. So what happens? You get the Maoist version. You get Maoism, which is this communism for poor people. Communism for, well, it's not communism because it's Stalinism. It's Stalinism for peasants is Maoism. See, remember, because Marx doesn't talk about peasants. He talks about the proletariat. He talks about the middle classes. He talks about the working classes. That you have to own the means of production. What Stalinism did was collectivize the farms so that farms now produced for the state. So it's a statism. The state is the most important thing. And in North Korea, the state is Kim Il-sung. So you have collectivization of farms. And like in China, And like in the Ukraine, you have massive famine and death. Massive famine and death. The collectivization of farms is always a failure. Always. And just like in the Great Leap Forward that we talked about in the China section, you have the problems that local officials, remember, Kim Il-sung cannot fail. He's the great leader, so he can't fail. So, you're the local government official. Do you want to fail? No. So when you're told, oh, you must increase productivity 10%, you're going to try to increase productivity 10%. And you're going to break a lot of things to try to you're going to make sure people don't sleep. You're going to torture people. You're going to do things to make sure you could get that at 10%. But what happens if you still don't get to that 10%? Do you want to be shot? Do you want to lose your cushy job? No. So you just fudge the numbers. You change the spreadsheets. So it looks like you still got the 10% increase. So Kim Il-sung looks at the numbers and goes, great, we have hit 10%. Well, meanwhile, there isn't 10% being created. It's all a mirage. And that hits that lie of the government, that lie of the local government, that lie of the local official, that lie hits the brick wall of fact that is famine and death. You can lie and say it's not a real problem. But it is a problem because it's going to hit the wall of famine and death. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are going to die. Millions of people are going to die. And you can ignore it as a government and say, I don't care. But it's still true. The second is forced industrialization. Again, Stalinism. Forced industrialization means poverty and slavery. Again, this hurts the collectivization of farms because you're pulling people off of the farms, putting them in factories that they're not trained for. They don't know what to do, and you're putting them in these factories and saying, make stuff. And what if they don't want to do that? Well, you force them to do that because you need to hit your quotas. You need to make steel. You need to make railroad ties. You need to make the stuff that an industrialized economy needs. And so what does this look like? North Korea is looking like a Korea owned by Japan, except Koreans are doing it to themselves. A Korean leader of a Korean government is force industrializing through slavery and poverty fellow Koreans. It's the Japanese model of extraction. And you have the dictatorial control over all information. The great leader, Kim Il-sung, will tell you what you need to know. He knows everything. You will learn what you need. Which sounds terrible. If you're an American, you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. But is more information... Here's the other side. Is more information always better? Is it? Can you trust all the information you're getting? 30% of Americans believe in QAnon. 30% believe that Democrats are members of a satanic pedophilia cult that hides kids away in non-existent basements of pizzerias. Now, and they're cannibals. Democrats are also cannibals. That's the other part. Like, you look at the information on Fox News or Facebook or Newsmax or InfoWars. There's plenty of information out there if you're an American. There's also your friends, your cousins, your mom, your dad. They all got information. Is that better? Are you better informed? Or is it like, oh my God, there's just too much. There's Twitter and Facebook and more online and YouTube and TikTok. And then there's the night shows. And then there's radio, talk shows. And you go on and on and on. What is the truth? Kim Il-sung is telling you, I've got the truth. And I'll tell you the truth. And I'm going to make your life easy by only telling you the stuff you need to know. You don't need to know all of this stuff on Reddit. You don't need to know all of the stuff on YouTube. I'll tell you what you need to know. Go out, live your life, go to work, love your kids, serve the state. And don't worry about it. I'll let you know. If it's really important, like the emergency buzzing on your phone, on your iPhone, I'll let you know. So I just want to give both sides. I want to give perspectives, because you may immediately go, oh, that sucks. But other people will look at the craziness of American information at the moment. Do you wear a mask or not wear a mask? Now, the answer is you wear a mask. But there's plenty of people who are like, well, I know this one study that says, I know this European study, I've heard this, my friend said. And you're like, oh my God. So, more information is not always better. Especially if you don't know if you can trust it. Or if it's lying to you. That's just propaganda. And so Kim Il-sung is saying, trust me, I got this. Okay, well, you don't really have too many other choices. And so, there you go. All right. So, what happens in North Korea? Well, Chinese economic reforms after 1979, and especially after Tiananmen Square in 1989, plus the Soviet Union collapse in 1989 to 1991, meant North Korea was effectively cut off from the world, except for China. So you now have an isolated country. It's now going to, again, North Korea is going to be called the Hermit Kingdom, which Korea was called in the 19th and the 18th century. Again, it's a world cut off, except for one connection to China. So it's the 19th century all over again. And then George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech happens, in which Iraq, Iran, and North Korea are called the Axis of Evil. And then we invaded Iraq in 2003, which convinced the government in Korea, we're next. There is an American army in South Korea. South Korea is way richer than us. We need to protect ourselves, and that means nuclear weapons. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have any nuclear program before 2003. It's just they turned it into high gear, high stakes. We have to get nuclear weapons come hell or high water. And they do. They do. North Koreans are a nuclear power. So what are our results? Our result is that South Korea is a rich modern country exporting culture. It's the envy of many countries in the world. North Korea is a slave state with concentration camps on the verge of collapse. Economically, essentially kept alive by China. It also has nuclear weapons. China is terrified of a North Korean collapse. It doesn't want chaos on its border, and it doesn't want South Korea absorbing it, which means the U.S. would be on its border. And remember, for 1,000 years, North Korea was not North Korea, but Korea was a Chinese ally. You're going to let a 1,000-year alliance disappear so the Americans get it? Like, dude, that doesn't play well. That's not going to look good in the Chinese history books. And so what do you get? You get President Trump, the dear leader of North Korea, Kim Il-jung, the third. He's the third leader. Kim Il-sung will die. His son will take over, and then he will die. And his son, Kim Il-jung, will take over. And the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, will talk. You'll have talks. Now, there's no solutions, but I got my domestic politics, but it would have been amazing if you got a solution. But they talk. There have been no talk for 50 years. Now they're getting together. They're talking. Kim Il-jung came to South Korea. President Trump, an American president, went to North Korea. President Moon Jae-in, went to North Korea. He stepped over the border. I mean, that's something. It's not peace, but it's something. It's more than there was. And so that's our situation on the Korean Peninsula. We got a militarized slave state in North Korea tied to China. We've got a rich, modern, democratic country in South Korea. We've got China involved. We've got the United States involved. And we've got, as of 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20, we've got nuclear weapons in North Korea, but also conversations between the 3-4 powers. And so hopefully those nuclear weapons don't need to ever be used, which would be bad for everybody involved. Nobody except maybe Kim Il-jung, and even he probably, if he's sane, and there's no reason to believe he's not sane, don't want nuclear weapons to be used on the Korean Peninsula. That's bad for everybody. 100 million people might die. So that's bad. So that's the world. That's Korea from 1945 to today, to literally 2018. So there we are. Good for the countries to be talking. If you want to know what's likely to happen, my opinion is, if there's no war, South Korea absorbs North Korea. It's West Germany taking over East Germany. South Korea, like West Germany, is just so much richer. It will basically buy a peace. But that can only happen if China allows it. And I don't know what China would be willing to take in order to allow that to happen. It would, I guess, have to be a North Korea collapses. But I honestly don't know. But the most likely thing, if you're the South Korean president, you look at what happened in 1989 to 1991 in Germany and go, that's my model. And likely, if I'm Kim Il-jung, I look at that model and I'm terrified, because the East German government was the most successful non-Moscow-based government, maybe even more successful than the Moscow-based government in Eastern Europe. And it went from existing in October 1989 to not in 6 months. To East Germany didn't exist. So, I mean, how do you go from being the dear leader to nothing? To absolutely nothing? I don't know. I honestly can't tell you. But if there's no war, if there's a war, it's going to be devastating. If there's no war, it's likely that South Korea will buy a peace, will buy unification. Just like West Germany did in East Germany. That's not a solution to all the cultural problems. but it's a solution. It is a solution to a reunification of Korea. And hopefully we'll see it. Hopefully we'll live to see it. It would be nice, because Korea is one of the countries in our class that has had a noble history that then descended into a complete disaster, and not of its own making. And so that Korea is now, South Korea especially, but that Korea could be one of the great countries of the world, a united Korea could be one of the great countries of the world, is really an amazing concept if you think about where we were in 1905. So, be safe, take care, and I'll see you soon.